Another really key central tenet of humanism is actually empathy, so consideration for other humans, but it also goes much wider than that, so consideration for every living thing on the planet, but also forward in time, so future generations, our children, our children's children.
As followers of Jesus, we have a saviour who lived on earth and encountered suffering and didn't flee from it or ignore it, but was called towards it. And I think that's very applicable in our current situation of climate change and biodiversity loss.
Hello and welcome to today's show. If you're watching here on YouTube, do make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more of these kinds of conversations. You can find our regular newsletter as well if you go to the links with today's show. You will even send you a free ebook when you register. Today, we're asking, can Christianity or humanism save the planet from climate change? As COP27, the UN Climate Summit in Egypt, gets underway, Lori Marriott and Rachel Mander join me. Both are involved in climate action. Both believe in the reality of human-induced climate change and its potentially disastrous effects on the world. But their activism is driven by different worldviews. So Lori is coordinator of Humanist Climate Action. As a humanist, she says her activism is driven by her belief that we have only one life and one planet. We've only got ourselves and can't expect divine help to sort out the problems we've created. Rachel is Strategy Development Officer for the Christian environmental charity Rocha International, working on climate change action. And she says her Christian faith fuels her concern for the planet, and caring for the environment is a deeply biblical value. So we'll be discussing the different ways they approach their work as a humanist and a Christian, and potentially which worldview provides the best foundation for the work of climate change action. So Rachel and Lori, welcome along to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Hi.
Great to have you both with me. Let's start with you, Lori. Tell us a bit about the work that you undertake, and will you be involved at all in COP27?
Sure. So, as you said, I'm part of Humanist Climate Action, which is a kind of a subgroup, if you like, of Humanist UK, which is our kind of wider organisation. And then there's also Humanist International, which is kind of the overarching international organisation. So Humanist UK, we've got a couple of aims within Humanist Climate Action. One is to engage humanists, so people that are part of our organisation or people that might kind of hold humanist beliefs. So to engage them to get involved in environmental action, so that might be in their own lives, so to make greener choices, for instance, to lead kind of greener or more ethical kind of lifestyles, but also to get involved with campaigning maybe, so to speak to their MPs, to speak to politicians, that kind of thing. And we also do that at HCA as well. So we respond to government consultations, to select committee inquiries, things like that, things that happen in Parliament, where they're kind of consulting on, maybe environmental targets or banning certain plastic items, things like that. So we're responding to those consultations. And also, putting out things like our declarations. So you asked about COP27. We did put out a declaration 2 days ago, stating not our aims, but what we think really should be happening over in Egypt. And it really, is on the back of kind of COP26 as well. Obviously, that was hosted in Glasgow here in the UK. So, it very much was following on from that. And we were involved in that as well, which maybe we'll speak about a bit more later, because that was actually, that was quite like an interfaith kind of event that we were involved in as well. So we might maybe back up on that later.
And as a humanist, what difference does that make to the way you engage that climate change activism? Because obviously there are lots of environmental groups out there. Why specifically are you doing this with that hat on of being a humanist?
Sure. So, maybe I'll just speak, personally for this bit. So when I found humanism, I was in my late teens, and it felt very much to me kind of like, finding my people, and perhaps the equivalent of what I imagine a religious person might say of kind of finding their spiritual home. So is that similar kind of feeling of belonging to a group of like-minded people? So for me, it's really, and a lot of humanists, it's really important to kind of put your humanism and your beliefs into practice, as it is as well for a lot of kind of religious people. So for me personally, that means, striving to live an ethical life and campaigning on issues that I really believe in, which is, a lot of environmental issues. So kind of marrying those two things together for me, that really gives me, the basis for my action. So my beliefs in living an ethical life and having empathy for others, and bringing about social change as a consequence of those things, or what you see kind of around you, the problems you see around you, and living that every day, and then also campaigning on it. So it kind of provides the foundation, I guess, of my actions, if that makes sense.
Thanks. That's great. Well, we look forward to digging into that more in the rest of the show. Rachel, welcome along to the show also. Tell us a bit about the work you do with Rocha International.
So Rocha is a Christian conservation charity. We turn 40 next year, and we work in 20 different countries around the world, doing different conservation projects that involves both the things on the ground and advocacy to protect different habitats, species, and the livelihoods of communities that depend on those areas as well. And that takes very different forms depending on the country that we're in. For example, in Ghana, we are protecting the Ottawa forest and campaigning for its protection. In the UK, we work with about 5,000 churches, helping them to embed climate action across their church in the things that they do together. So it takes a really wide variety of forms, and I'm part of the team doing that work.
And again, just briefly, for you as a Christian, how does your Christian faith impact the way that you approach your work?
Well, just like Lori has spoken from a personal perspective, actually it was my faith that brought me into the environmental movement, because it was when I joined a church, and there were people, friends I had there, who really saw the connection between their Christian faith and a concern for the environment. And it encouraged me to look at scripture again and see, oh yeah, absolutely, this is part of the Christian faith. It's a theme that runs all the way through scripture of caring for the environment, and also God's concern that as people we take care of the environment. So suddenly I saw the connection between the commandments in the Bible to love God and to love neighbours as very much intrinsically connected to my responsibility as a person of faith to do those things as well.
Great. Well, great to have those introductions to you both. Thank you. There's a quote actually I'd like to start us off with and just get both of your reactions to this one. Environmentalist Gus Speth said this: "I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science we could address these problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed and apathy, and to deal with those we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that." To what extent do you agree with that kind of framing of it, Lori, that this is actually ultimately a spiritual kind of problem, if you like?
Yeah, it's a really interesting quote. I think I would say I largely agree with it. Maybe from my perspective, I think he said we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. Maybe I would just change the word spiritual to societal. Like from my perspective. Having said that, he said kind of the issues are, selfishness and greed, I think was in there. I certainly wouldn't disagree with that. I think those are maybe like things that have been built into society, the way that we've kind of industrialized, the way that we've set up kind of business and capitalism, those are all kind of like intrinsic within that system. So I certainly kind of wouldn't disagree along those lines. I think it's interesting. The last thing he said there, I think was we scientists don't know how to do that. I'm not sure I would agree with that. I mean, obviously, sure, it must be true from his perspective. That's the statement that he's made. Myself, academically, I come from a social scientist, social sciences kind of background. I certainly don't think a lot of social scientists would agree with that, because actually you probably find methodology and kind of policy change that would kind of come out of the social sciences anyway. And certainly as humanists, we do believe that every kind of policy needs to be based on kind of evidence, reason, science. That all needs to be, the backing behind anything, for example, the government do, or that, we think might be a good idea in terms of change in society.
I suppose the question I want to ask in follow-up to that then is I suppose I drew from that quote by Gus Speth that selfishness, greed and apathy, he says, are the main problems, and they are essentially human problems. They're individual problems. And I guess, it could be argued it's a spiritual change within the human that's needed, not just policies or scientific, technology. People have to be motivated to want to actually change the world.
Sure.
And that starts with their own. Do you feel like humanism has a basis for doing that in a sense? Because I'd be interested to hear from Rachel in a moment as to whether she feels Christianity specifically offers that kind of motivation for people. But do you feel humanism can, I guess, have that kind of heart to kind of, maybe if you don't quite like the word spiritual, it obviously has sort of supernatural overtones, but that sort of heart change that is being talked about in this?
Sure. I mean, I just want to quickly pick up on something you just said there, which was, those things, selfishness, greed, apathy, they're human problems, or, things that we display in our behaviour or ways that we approach the world. Absolutely true. No, I wouldn't disagree with that whatsoever. I think the point I just make there is humans have all kinds of different belief systems, different religions. There are obviously many religions. Humanism itself is a belief system. And I mean, the latest kind of data we have for the UK anyway kind of says that I think it's 53% of people in Britain describes themselves as having no religion. So I don't think necessarily that kind of having a religion or being spiritual in that way would necessarily be the way to change people's minds. If we're saying, that's a human problem, that kind of selfishness. If a lot of people don't actually believe in religion or kind of follow a particular belief system, I'm not sure it's necessarily like the most obvious way to kind of go about changing that. In terms of humanism itself, as I said, reason, evidence, science, obviously kind of core tenets. But another really key central tenet of humanism is actually empathy. So consideration for other humans, but it also goes much wider than that. So consideration for every living thing on the planet, but also forward in time. So future generations, our children, our children's children, humans hundreds of years from now, and the descendants of other living things as well. So animals, plants, etc. So that kind of really wide-ranging empathy is really key to humanism. So I think that can provide a really strong foundation in terms of the kind of perhaps ethical or societal changes we're talking about. So if you think about that empathy and then you extend that out into policy change, for example, by thinking about, okay, well, are we leaving the planet better than we found it? Are we using our resources sustainably? Are we impacting other living creatures in a really negative way? We're causing other creatures to become extinct. So that's obviously, a very negative impact that we potentially can't take back. So I think, if you think about it in that way, by connecting that empathy to kind of change in that way, that provides quite a strong foundation for me anyway.
Thank you. Rachel, any thoughts on this quote we've started with from Gus Speth, from yourself?
Yeah, I think it's a really important quote for pointing out that actually the problem that we have with climate change is not a matter of the concentration of parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, although obviously that's a huge component, but it's not primarily a technical question. Actually, it's a question about our values and who we are and the choices that we make and our moral decision making. And it's those things that have driven that increase in concentration in the atmosphere, and not just technical malfunction that we need to technically fix. So it's important both in terms of identifying the diagnosis of what the situation that we face, and also in terms of pointing us towards the solution.
And how do we change as humans? I mean, obviously Laurie's laid out a basis there, empathy, and obviously evidence, reason, following the science. These are the tenets, she says, of humanism, essentially, in the way that we can make a positive change. Is that a satisfactory basis for you, or what would you need in addition to those things, which you might share in common in many ways?
Yeah, I think all of the things that Lori has pointed to are hugely important and could also be found within many religious traditions, not just Christianity as well. But in terms of, I think, some of the depth that Christianity can bring is both a belief that actually people really can change. We believe that just in part of knowing the process of becoming believers, but also then in terms of what it is that drives people's motivations and choices, and the rest of the wider things in their life as well. Actually, Christianity is a really important source of that, and some of what drives some of the systems that we're in currently is a huge belief in economic growth to bring prosperity and the importance of consumption within people finding individual meaning. And actually, Christianity says those things are not going to bring satisfaction, and there's something much greater that will make life worthwhile as part of knowing God and relating to other people well, and by extension also relating to the earth well as well.
Having said all that, Rachel, do you think Christians are generally regarded in culture as being on the side of, climate action and so on? I mean, certainly you are, and a Rocha International are. Is that a kind of focus, though, that is prevalent enough among Christian communities?
I think it's growing. It's not where I would hope it would be. And I think in part, there's a huge number of Christians around the world. And sometimes just by virtue of sheer numbers, the extremes get more extreme as well. And so we see some really high profile cases where Christians are not on the right side here. And I really hope that changes in time. And I think that is starting to happen already.
Lori, what's your view on people of faith and Christians in particular, and their approach to climate change? I'm sure you welcome anyone who's, marching with you, being active in this area, whatever their belief system. But what's your general view of how good or bad Christianity is for the planet in that sense?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, of course. Yeah. Like, the more the merrier, really. For the cause, kind of thing. I think I would be very hesitant to, make any broad brush statements kind of, about all Christians or anything along those lines. One thing maybe I would just draw attention to might be kind of, if you look at somewhere like the United States, which, I would say is not at all reflective of somewhere like the UK or a lot of other places around the world. But if we just look there for a moment, historically speaking, that's obviously one of the biggest emitters of emissions and kind of driver of climate crisis and biodiversity loss, etc. And what you can see there is that the religious right in particular, as Rachel said, it is a bit of an extreme example perhaps. But, there are still a lot of cases where they kind of deny science. So whether that's not teaching evolution in schools, but they're also not teaching, about the climate crisis in schools. So that's, sometimes not on the curriculum in a similar way. And there is, a case of some groups there being really quite opposed to environmental legislation, and actually using their religious beliefs to kind of deny that it's even necessary, if you see what I mean there. As I said, I don't think that reflects all Christians. I just think the religious right in the US does have quite a big voice and is actually quite impactful. Not saying it's, a massive group or anything, but they do have influence. And it is on a country which historically, as I said, has had a massive impact and is in the position where they need to make, some of the biggest change. And they could also be leaders for that change as well. So, it's a bit of a worrying situation there.
Rachel, do you want to respond to that particular aspect of this?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a really good example that Lori has raised here of what we've seen, and actually the way that religion can intersect with both cultural and political forces, which is really difficult to separate. And one of the reasons why these examples are so notorious is because they're attached to sections of the world's population with a huge amount of power. So it really skews the picture of considering Christianity as a whole, because that's what comes to mind, rather than the breadth and variety of Christian traditions that are actually working in a completely opposite way, and wouldn't necessarily associate themselves with some of the things that they see happening in other countries and contexts.
Yeah, I suppose the other sometimes criticism that's levelled, and I don't know if this is one you would agree with, Lori, against Christians and people of faith as well. They believe that, there's a heaven out there, and the world, it's not, we don't just have this world, there's and maybe perhaps we can just assume God's going to step in and do something to kind of change the story or something. Is that a concern of yours, Lori, that it may result in a sort of an apathy if people of faith believe that, it's not all down to them, basically?
I mean, sure, yeah. I mean, again, that's maybe just a small, small, hard to measure, but like that maybe is, a subsection of Christians that do believe that. And I'm sure there's many like Rachel that think, well, actually, we really have to act here and now. As you said, humanists do believe this is our one life. And that I don't know if you've heard that famous quote from Ban Ki-moon, the former UN General Secretary, about there being no planet B. And to me, that's actually quite similar to the humanist philosophy. There isn't a planet B, there isn't kind of a life B or that kind of thing. This really is our one opportunity to live and to live well and to leave that legacy of sustainability and a planet that's actually inhabitable for everyone and all species. So, for me, that is another thing that kind of is a motivator for me, because if I do just have this one life, then actually it's my responsibility to act and to call out where I see problems and to try and make change. And that's actually my responsibility, both to everyone around me, to myself, and to future generations, and also to my life's legacy, if that makes sense. If I'm not going to go kind of elsewhere once I die, then I want to, whenever it may be towards the end of my life, thinking, well, actually, I've lived really well. I've lived really ethically. I've made a positive impact on people. I've made a positive impact on the planet as well. So I guess, back to your original question, I guess, that maybe that is a concern where Christians or people from other religions do believe that. But, perhaps that is like an area where their minds could be changed within their faith, for example.
Well, Rachel, how would you, respond to that if you encountered that Christian perspective? I'm sure you have. Well, do we need to worry about it? After all, God will sort it out. Maybe, hey, there's always heaven to look forward to. What's your response as a Christian to that?
Yeah, there are a few different levels of this that I think are important to touch on. The first, I think, is that actually the picture in the Bible is not that the earth disappears and that everybody goes to heaven. Rather, it's that heaven is joined back to earth, and that a future life happens on earth. And therefore, as part of living as Christians now and witnessing to the hope that we believe is to come, it's modelling those relationships in the here and now. And the other part of that is also thinking about, just as Lori has talked about, responsibility and having one life here and now. Actually, a very strong part of Christian belief is understanding that we are responsible, and we're responsible and we will have to give account of what we have done as part of God's judgment, but also mercy and grace. And therefore, actually what we are doing now matters not just for the here and now, but takes on greater significance. And I think the other thing that's part of that is understanding both in scripture that it says that actually one of the changes that happens at the end of the earth is that those that destroy the earth will be destroyed. That's in Revelation 11. And also that the model as followers of Jesus, we have a saviour who lived on earth and encountered suffering and didn't flee from it or ignore it, but was called towards it. And I think that's very applicable in our current situation of climate change and biodiversity loss, and the circumstances and impacts that follow from that. Is actually our responsibility as people of faith is to be in the middle of that, working out how it is that we can reflect God's love for the earth and the people that he's made.
We're going to return to this in just a moment. We'll go to a quick break for now, because I want to talk about. I'll keep the questions with you for a bit more, Rachel. There was a church during COP26 last year in Scotland that had a controversial banner that actually got torn down by protesters, which said the world's most urgent need is churches preaching Christ crucified, not climate change. And I think this again is where some of the criticism gets levelled at Christians who say we shouldn't be focusing on these particular issues. It needs to be something else. But we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back in just a moment. We're talking about climate change, a humanist and a Christian giving their different perspectives today.
Have you ever found yourself tongue-tied when someone asks you, is there evidence for God? What about suffering? Did Jesus really rise from the dead? I'd like to introduce you to Confident Christianity, our online apologetics course. Featuring video training from world-renowned thinkers such as William Lane Craig, John Lennox, Amy Orr Ewing and Gary Habermas, you'll learn how to understand, defend and share your faith with confidence. I'll also share lessons I've learned from over 15 years of hosting atheists and Christians in dialogue. You can enrol now at premier.org.uk/course or click the link with this video.
Welcome back to the show. We're talking about climate change. Can Christianity or humanism save the planet? I'm joined by Lori Marriott and Rachel Mander. Lori is coordinator of Humanist Climate Action. Rachel is with the Christian environmental charity Rocha International. And we're talking about the two different worldviews they represent, humanism and Christianity, and whether either is better suited, as it were, for a foundation for the work of climate change action. I'm kind of keeping the pressure on you at the moment, Rachel, because again, not all the stories are always positive when it comes to Christians' attitudes to engaging climate change. As I said, there was a church in Glasgow last year during COP26 that hung a banner outside that said the world's most urgent need is churches preaching Christ crucified, not climate change. That was obviously very controversial. It got torn down. But it does sort of represent a concern that I think a number of Christians do have, which is, well, look, isn't it most important to be sort of preaching the gospel, bringing people to faith, and isn't the sort of care for the climate a kind of a secondary issue, and we shouldn't let it distract us from this primary issue of evangelism and so on? What's your response to that, Rachel?
Yeah, it's a real shame where we see Christians effectively playing like a zero-sum game about what can be most important. And it's particularly a shame because really when they're talking about that, they're talking about a gospel that's incredibly narrow in the sense of what it means to preach is just to talk and like tell the news of Jesus Christ. But actually the gospel is so much wider than that. Actually, preaching Christ crucified is also about preaching the hope, which is not just a hope for humanity, but also the reconciliation of the earth. And it's also, we know that Christian faith is so much wider than that. It's also about discipleship. It's about caring for people in all sorts of situations. And in many senses, they would absolutely agree with that. So it's a real shame to see that particular instance that you mentioned happened. And I was actually there at COP26, and I saw the discussion and the frustration that happened with the many Christians who were present at COP26 and the many churches who had opened their doors throughout those 2 weeks of COP26, also in Glasgow, who were providing drinks, providing rest stops for people who are attending COP26 so that they could have conversations and have places to be and be taken care of. And unfortunately, it's one of those things where it's the bad news that travels more quickly than all the other things that were also present there in Glasgow.
Sure. Laurie, what were your thoughts? I don't know if you saw that story anyway, but on that particular example, and does it for you represent generally an attitude among people of faith that you've encountered, or is it just the exception, as Rachel would see it?
I don't think it does, Justin. I really don't know. I think, perhaps sometimes there are individuals or small groups that have opinions or make decisions which do then get taken to form a wider context. As Rachel said, the bad news kind of being picked up in that particular instance. And actually, really, I just wanted to back Rachel up there and reflect what she said, that I was down in London. It sounds like you were up in Glasgow, Rachel. And actually, it was fantastic marching in the faith and belief block. We were involved, in the kind of preparations beforehand for a couple of months. And actually, they very kind of kindly renamed the faith block to the faith and belief block so that we felt more, included and inclusive in that group. And on the actual day, it was just so lovely is the only way I can describe it. The atmosphere, you know, marching all together in a group, you're there from different perspectives, different worldviews. You know, everyone's got their own kind of banners up, but you're all just kind of mingling and like having a chat, and isn't this wonderful, and isn't this so important, and really we all just want the same thing. So you know, as Rachel said, it is unfortunate that there are those instances sometimes. I certainly wouldn't say it's an exclusively Christian thing either. You'll always get, you know, people with views that don't kind of align with, you know, the kind of thing that we would like to see happening. And that can come from all different kinds of, you know, motivation, not just Christians. So while it is unfortunate to see that in that context, as Rachel said, a lot of churches and a lot of other, you know, religious groups and buildings were opening themselves up, were, you know, inviting lots of different people in, lots of people of different faiths, no faith. So really it was overall a great example of, you know, collaboration and cooperation rather than division.
Yeah. Rachel, I guess you would equally, you know, say, yes, we will march alongside anyone who shares the values around climate change and so on. Is there any, you know, perhaps sort of now turning to kind of whether humanism represents there are any challenges for the humanist or atheist when it comes to climate change? Are there any sort of concerns you have, Rachel, about to what extent that particular worldview can support the sort of responsibility and the challenge of climate change yourself?
Well, I think I see many things of value within a humanist set of beliefs, and you can see that from the fruit of the actions as well that come out of some of the work that Lori is doing. But at the same time, I think many Christians would feel that actually one of the things that might be difficult for putting action on a foundation of humanist belief would be feeling like the values that have been chosen or that people have are based on experience and what they are believing in the present moment, but actually in terms of having external reference points for that belief, or that actually the beliefs are kind of circular in some senses, and actually it would be quite easy to become I guess disenfranchised, and when things are not going so well for whatever reason, for that sort of belief to collapse into almost like a nihilism, or something that just reverts back to being like because you could use some of the same things that humanists would point to, for example, and there only being this life, to say, if there's only this life and I'm responsible for me and it's just me that I have to think about, then in which case I can choose not to empathise with other people, and I can choose to make decisions that are not in line with environmental care or caring for others. And actually, what's to stop me from doing that? I think that would be something that people would kind of point towards as a concern.
How would you respond to that then, Lori?
I think it's interesting what you said there, kind of just at the end about kind of choosing. For me, at least personally, I think I could no more choose not to be empathetic than perhaps a religious person could choose not to have faith. So for me, it's maybe a very similar internal kind of feeling, or kind of, you know, core part of who I am or my personality. And as I, you know, said before, that's kind of what I identified within humanism, which is what kind of drew me to it. So I think it does have to come back to that empathy. And I think perhaps in terms of apathy, that's maybe just you know, we were talking about it before with that quote that we had at the beginning, it being a human kind of problem, if you like. Perhaps it's more of a societal thing. So the ways that we approach life, different things, different technology, perhaps things like social media, different things maybe have driven us in general to become more apathetic and less empathetic, you know, with each other and with the earth. But I think perhaps bringing it back to humanism or to faith could actually help with that, rather than kind of driving it the other way, if you see what I mean. So perhaps if the problem is apathy, It's more of a general problem that we could almost both be the solutions to, if you see what I mean there.
Rachel?
I think that was a really nice reply, particularly around the kind of experience that of having that belief and the response to choice. I guess the worry then is where people are not having that experience and how that kind of connects. And I think it's difficult then to say, actually, there is a clear right and wrong, and we need you to be on the right side of that. If actually right and wrong is kind of set by someone's personal experience or their feeling of responding to particular moral values that they either do or do not have.
Yeah, I guess that's an interesting question, because it takes it to the level, Lori, of okay, how do you persuade the person who simply is apathetic, who simply says, well, I don't believe in God either, Lori, and I think that means that I can basically, we're in this for ourselves, and it's inconvenient for me to have to change my lifestyle and so on. I guess from Rachel's point of view, she says, well, there's a sort of a moral standard out there that she can appeal to. There is a God. There is there is an ultimate judgment of the way people live their lives. So someone, obviously this person I'm describing is not a humanist. They're not someone who says, we should all be striving for the value of, the flourishing of humanity as a whole. But they're a pretty selfish sort of person. But how do you persuade that person, in a sense, to share your humanist values, I suppose, as regards the climate change and so on?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think there's maybe, a couple of points here. So I obviously I would never conflate being humanist with all non-religious people. That's a very large group out there who are non-religious, are not humanist, are maybe would say they're not anything, or, so that's obviously like a very large group, probably. And then there's a very large group of religious people and different groups of non-religious people that still have belief systems. So I think if you think about that, this is change and this is a journey that we all need to be taking together, you then have to take a number of different approaches to bringing people with you. So if people most engage with the issue through a belief system, be that their religious faith, be that humanism, then great, try and bring those people with us, try and convince them, try and persuade them that, as Rachel said, these are the moral standards for action. But if they don't engage through any of those means, then we need to find another way to engage with them. So is that through another type of community group? Is that through a charity? Is that through an NGO? Is there one specific thing? Is there one animal they love? Is there one, specific thing that they care about that you can then build on that to a wider appreciation and a wider empathy for some of the other issues? And I think it's then also important, to note that that's why we then actually need to campaign for change at, government level and international level, because as well as in our personal lives, to get that kind of that wider social change, it does also need to come from the top. I think it needs, to be driven from the bottom, if you see what I mean. But there does still need to be, that regulation and those kind of things put in over that level, over that kind of national and international level. So it does still need to kind of come from that level. And to bring people along with that, I think, there's different things you need to do there, but it's about kind of, again, coming back to cultural change and how you present those changes and like the messaging there. So, presenting it as actually what we're striving for here is a better type of lifestyle, a greener and more sustainable. Your children's children are going to, have this nicer life and lifestyle and planet to live on. And isn't that something that we can all really care about?
Rachel?
I empathise with what Lori has just said in terms of actually there are many ways to talk with people about how we respond to climate change and how it may feed in with their existing values, whatever those might be. However, I think it just isn't capable of answering that kind of bottom line question, which is that people have no obligations to actually share some of those values or to act in line with them. And I think that is a difficulty of kind of having humanist belief or using that as a foundation for action.
Are you saying then that Christianity does offer that kind of moral obligation, that value, that it's hard to find a foundation for in humanism? Is that essentially what you're arguing for there, Rachel?
I think from my personal perspective, I would feel like the foundation that Christianity offers is more secure in that respect, because the claims that it's making about a worldview are actually in many ways like external metaphysical ones, and I think that gives a firmer foundation.
Yeah. So I guess we're getting into quite philosophical territory here, Lori. But I suppose the challenge then is to say why share your concern about the planet? Why not be ultimately a capitalist, a selfish person? So, whatever, not really care. I mean, there are even people, who I've heard kind of coming from a non-religious, atheist, skeptical perspective, who say, well, maybe best if humans weren't here. The antinatalists who say we're a plague on this planet, we're a cancer, and in a sense, it's quite an anti-humanist message, but it's saying it'd be better off if humans didn't exist. So there's kind of a variety of options out there for the non-religious person, in terms of what sort of philosophy they embody, what kind of values ultimately, and what sort of solution they come up with. What makes you think that your perspective is the right one, as it were, when there are a lot of different ways that a non-religious person could respond to the issue of climate change? Yeah,
so 2 points there. Just to go back to your kind of point about humans, being a bit of a plague on the planet kind of perspective. I think that there's certainly a way to look at that that's not entirely not true, if you like. I think what's really important there is to kind of remember and emphasize that we are a part of nature. We're not a separate kind of thing that's been plonked on the planet and, we now have dominion because we're the cleverest or we're the most, technologically advanced, etc. We, certainly the humanist perspective, that we are completely a part of nature. We're a part of that web of life, that kind of interconnected web. And, the reason that we are facing a lot of the problems that we are is because we have kind of knocked that web out of balance. We're impacting it and interfering with it in ways that, using more resources than we, really should, or using other species' resources and so on, and affecting the environment kind of quicker than it can catch up with what we're doing to it. So I think it's really important there to remember that we are actually a part of it, and also that we will be impacted by the things that we are doing as well. So the breakdown of that web, for example, biodiversity loss, that will actually impact us as a species as well, because we are still a part of nature. If all of the insects kind of die off, we're going to find it extremely difficult to actually, feed ourselves. So that's, a very clear interaction there between us and the rest of nature. So we need to remember that actually it's, there isn't a separation there. I think coming back to your other point about humanism, I would maybe bring it back to the personal level and say it's the right perspective for me. So I'm not saying it's not the right perspective for everyone. But for me personally, faith, religion, and whatever belief system you choose to follow, they're quite personal things. They're quite personal choices a lot of the time. So, for example, if you spoke to a random person on the street, an adult, and kind of said like, okay, well, I think you should believe in this religion, you're not going to convince them by talking at them. It's not an academic debate for me. It's a more internal perspective, I guess. You speak to a lot of people that kind of like take a personal journey and come to join or leave your faith and so on. So it is something that can't kind of be talked into belief, if you see what I mean. So this perspective is the right one for me because it's what I believe. It's not necessarily the right perspective for anyone else, which again is why I think you need to come back to that kind of array of different approaches of engaging people. But in terms of kind of convincing people, I think you just kind of maybe sometimes need to get onto the practical level of, well, you know, if we make these changes, this will be the consequence, and that's better for you, that's better for your neighbours, that's better for everyone, really.
Yeah. Rachel, any commentary on that?
I understand where Laurie's coming from here. I think a lot of that kind of perspective is dependent a lot on an appeal that's either pragmatic or to the like utility of taking action, which can be very persuasive. But I think in particular thinking about people's long-term action and kind of staying with like an environmental movement, for example, actually utility or urgency will motivate people for a period of time, but it may not be enough to keep them going. And I do think that's one of the strengths of something like faith, is that often it provides a community of other people that will sustain that action, often in like a local way, if we're talking about churches, for example, that are rooted somewhere particular. But also that idea that there is hope and there is meaning to life, that is external, and therefore hope or people's perspectives and outlook on the situation of climate change and biodiversity needn't be a toss up between optimism or pessimism or between arrogance and despair, but is actually much wider than that. And instead of kind of taking a read of the temperature in terms of policy making or many political events which are changeable, actually the basis for action is on values that are deeper than that and commonly held within a community and are based on scripture and wider faith and belief.
So in a sense, do you worry that there may be a kind of a certain level of burnout if people are kind of obviously care about climate change and being activists about it? Do you believe that the Christian church offers something that helps to sort of, I suppose, give that a place in which people can hold that and not sort of simply, I suppose, just get frustrated at, you know, the lack of change or whatever it might be? Presumably, Rachel, you find that being part of that faith community is bigger than just the climate change thing. It
is. It gives a wider perspective. It also there are like a lot of like rich pastoral resources present within faith, whether that's practices of grief or lament, an understanding of what there is to be angry at as just not just like an internal feeling or a random set of circumstances that have brought something about, but actually being able to say, no, actually some things are evil, and some of the pain that is being felt is a result of evil within the earth and the wider universe. And actually it's not up to us to determine what is going well or badly, and it's not all on us to save the world. Actually, we are part of a much bigger story, and we are absolutely responsible for the ways in which we participate in that. But there's also a source of strength that's beyond us, both from God and also within a community of other people who believe, that has a really wonderful and awe-inspiring story and narrative that's based on what Christians would say is the truth about forgiveness and grace, and God's purposes for all creation.
As you said, you appreciate the fact that faith communities, Christian communities, give people a kind of an environment in which they can pursue these kinds of issues, justice, climate change, and so on. Presumably, you feel you have your own community as well, the humanist community, from which you can do that. One of Rachel's concerns was, are you ultimately kind of having to appeal to people on the basis of their self-interest and the pragmatism and that kind of thing, whereas faith communities can offer something that has a bigger story, that they say that you're part of something much bigger than yourself, you're part of a that there is a God, there is a kind of a story that you're part of, and that sometimes can motivate self-sacrifice and giving and activism, and being part in ways that sort of, if it's just us, it's just me, arguably it is more difficult to kind of get the motivation and to sort of see the long-term kind of engagement. I don't know how true you find that, or whether you would say, no, actually, that's not my experience. What's your response to that, Lori?
I think that's not my experience within kind of humanism and what I do and that kind of like the day-to-day work and so on. I think there is that kind of that sense of community and us kind of working together and having the same beliefs, which has led us to have the same concerns and then take action. I think perhaps where I would agree is the people that don't hold humanist beliefs and are just kind of maybe non-religious people, or perhaps people from other religions or not Christianity, etc., where I just think like kind of almost neither of us are going to reach them by going down that route. So whether it's trying to appeal to their faith, which maybe they don't have, or trying to say like, well, I'm a humanist and I believe in empathy and I believe in science, so have you thought about that kind of thing? Neither of those approaches might work. So perhaps you do need to get practical for those people, but even people who don't have those kind of beliefs, they are still human, and they do, I think, still have innate within them the capacity for empathy, the capacity for understanding, the capacity for caring about things. So I think trying to tap into that, even if it doesn't have a framework around it, so a Christian framework or a humanist framework or any other kind of religious framework, trying to tap into that, it's almost an emotional part of humanity, I guess, or perhaps that's a good way to put it, tap into that humanity, to reach those people that aren't going to be reached by the various perspectives. So I don't necessarily think that, imposing the humanist way of doing things or framework onto all these issues is the way to go. It's just, for me, it's a really good way to engage those people that do feel at home within the humanist belief system. And to engage them by saying, okay, well, these are your beliefs. Have you thought about it in the context of the environment? Because they may not have, they may try to live a greener lifestyle, but they might not have engaged in terms of campaigning or in terms of, marching at COP26, things like that. So it's, trying to get them to take that extra step as well to kind of integrate that more into their life and almost prepare them for that, that kind of change that we do need to happen. Does that kind of answer your question?
yeah, no, it's really helpful. And we're going to go to a final break and then we'll just have some final comments really from you both. I appreciate that in a sense I'm sort of almost stoking an argument here that probably wouldn't exist in reality when you're both, marching at COP26 or whatever. But I think it is sometimes helpful to kind of dig into the sort of the ultimate motivations that kind of are there between a humanist and a Christian. But I'm sure in the end we'll talk about the common ground you both share as well, as we already have. We'll go to a final break and we'll be back in just a moment's time with Rachel Mander and Lori Marriott talking about climate change as COP27 is underway. For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter. So we've been talking about climate change. Two different perspectives joining me on the show today, a Christian and a humanist. Lori Marriott is coordinator of Humanist Climate Action. And Rachel Mander is from Rocha International, the Christian conservation and environmental charity. I've sort of forced you both to kind of disagree with each other on a sort of fundamental metaphysical level about where your the foundations of this go, even though obviously on the actual science of climate change and what needs to happen to reverse it and so on, I'm sure there'd be a lot of agreement between you in that sense. And you'd happily march with each other, when it comes to activism in this area. But I suppose I'm interested as well, just in working out what your faith or lack of faith, or a humanist perspective gives you in terms of what the future may hold. So, Rachel, even while you're encouraging Christians and churches to get on board and to be involved and see this as a biblical mandate to care for the creation and to because this is about not simply about souls going to heaven, but about heaven and earth being joined together, and we are, if you like, partaking in that restoration that is ultimately going to be fulfilled in God. Presumably you also have a kind of a faith, a confidence that actually the future is safe in God's hands, that the end of the story won't be extinction, annihilation. Is that something that in a sense helps with your climate activism, Rachel, as a Christian?
Yeah, I would say it does. And what I want to make clear though is that does not mean that everything is absolutely going to be all right and that things won't get worse by our inaction now. Often I think it can be easy for people who are Christian perhaps just to jump right to the end and be like, oh, actually, we believe it's going to be okay. But there's a quote that talks about the fact that before Easter, Jesus goes through Gethsemane. And actually, we are looking at a future where the speed and the extent and the horror of death are going to be increased in a situation of really extreme climate change. And we need to take that seriously. We need to be prepared for that. In the midst of that, I think it's really helpful that personally I often think about something that the Catholic writer Dorothy Day wrote, which was that there's always the fact of the fall, but there's also always the fact of redemption, which is pointing to this Christian belief that we are seeing brokenness, and everywhere we see that in the context of climate change, in the suffering and the impacts that has. But at the same time, we believe in a much bigger picture and a promise of renewal and of grace and of a God who is both creator and redeemer of everything that has been made. And I think that's really helpful when you're in the midst of taking action, and perhaps you on some of the good days you feel more optimistic, a good decision is made by government, you're part of a campaign that makes a real difference, and there are other times where you'll do exactly the same set of actions and you'll get a different result back, or there'll be an election somewhere in the world and there'll be 1,000 opinion articles about how this spells disaster for the climate. And actually I have found personally that my faith is a steadying force in the midst of that. That means I'm not surprised by those changes. I'm not kind of swept away with them, but instead I've got I am aware that there's a bigger picture and actually a whole load of things that I can't see, and my faith is part of that story.
And that, Lori, I've often heard the term climate anxiety being something that's quite prevalent now among young people, and I wonder partly whether that's because they are being fed, perhaps a very realistic outlook of what the future might hold, but without a kind of sense of hope as well behind it. And I guess for Rachel, that is an important part of her worldview. While she accepts the reality that things could really get a lot worse, that there is a sort of an ultimate hope that sustains her and the work she does, and means that she doesn't fall into kind of despair or nihilism or kind of just constant anxiety about it. Where would you point a humanist on that front? Because there really are no guarantees. It could be extinction. It could be it gets worse and then it gets really bad and that's the end on a humanist. As Richard Dawkins would say, the universe doesn't owe you anything. It could just be, end of humans. What kind of gives you hope on the basis that you don't have that kind of bigger narrative to fall back on that Rachel does?
Sure. I mean, just quickly picking up on your point there that you made about kind of climate anxiety and the way that some of these things do get presented, the constant, bad news that we're fed. I'd say perhaps that's a kind of an innate way in which the media works, perhaps, to kind of to grab the clicks of the likes, the reading of these articles is to present sometimes the worst case scenario, the bad news rather than the good news, rather than the achievements, rather than the successes. So I think that's a really difficult issue. That is something that we need to be aware of. I think perhaps actually that the work both Rachel and I do, hopefully for some people actually counters that by saying actually, you can take action, you can have hope, you can have empathy, and you can kind of, have an impact in that way. For me personally, I banged on about it, but I do come back to empathy, which leads me to hope. And I think one way to look at that as well, which I've just personally found quite helpful, is to think every single one of our ancestors, so all three of us sitting here, everyone on the planet, was a successful person because we're here talking about it. So they all lived a life that in some way was a success, because obviously they had children who had us. And they all had to face, different things at different times, some very difficult time periods. And that's obviously true for all animals as well. And there have been some very difficult times in the history of the planet. So, if you want to go really far back, you might talk about the extinction of the dinosaurs. And, that kind of evolution will tell us that it's maybe that very event that kind of led to mammals becoming actually the more dominant group of animals on the planet, which ultimately led to, again, us being here and talking about it. So if I think about it in that way, and other things we've experienced, you could talk about the plague in the 1500s, you could talk about the more recent pandemic, you could talk about the hole in the ozone, which we managed to close through action. If I think about all of the things that we've overcome, all of the things that we've adapted to, that gives me hope that actually we can face this challenge. We have responsibility to face this challenge, and we can, tackle it and kind of come out the other side. And actually, it might be to an even better world. It might be to an even nicer place to live, where everything we do is based on empathy and consideration and sustainability. And that might sound like a bit of a utopia, but if I kind of have that in the back of my mind while I'm reading the news or while I'm taking action, that really gives me hope and kind of motivation, and it's certainly a driving force.
Thank you both for being on the show today. Any final thoughts as we close out today's show? I'll start with you, Rachel, and then go to Lori.
I think I've been really struck by some of the action that I've been involved in, of how many commonalities there actually are in people's perspectives. Many of the people that I will march with will say, actually, things are broken and not as they should be, and we should be part of making that different. And part of that difference is bringing actions that reflect our love of so many things. And for me, that really fits well within a Christian worldview. And it's really wonderful to meet others who have part of that in their own beliefs and frameworks as well.
Lori, any final thoughts as we close out?
Well, yeah, I mean, as humans, we have a history of conflict, all different types of conflict, of war. Some of it is religious conflict. So if people of different religions, of no religion, of non-religious beliefs, such as Rachel and myself, can come together and largely agree that these are the problems, these are solutions, let's get there, let's get there all together. Doesn't that actually put, people like politicians to shame? The people that are actually democratically tasked with solving these things and sometimes can't seem to agree on the smallest thing. And yet people who are coming from completely different worldviews can actually put their voices all together and show that kind of solidarity and almost be, this kind of shining beacon of actually we can cooperate, we can collaborate, and we can make change and be, we don't have to be on different sides of the argument. Like, isn't that a wonderful thing?
It's a good note to end on. Thank you very much, Lori and Rachel, for joining me. I'll make sure there are links to both of your websites so people can find out more about it, and all the very best as you continue your work in this area. Thanks for being with me on the show today.
Thanks for having us.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.